Thank you for joining this awesome collection of energetic and passionate feminists. Our panel is titled The Future of Feminism, Evolutions, Transformation, and Possibilities of Feminisms. That's plural. On our panel tonight is Dr. Jeannie Hemming, Dr. Michelle Wilkemer, and Dr. Andi Augustin-Billy. I am Dr. Mandy Donahoe, and I absolutely, even though I'm serving as moderator, reserve the right to use my voice. So this panel was organized because of student interest in the complexities of feminism, what it is, where it has been, and what it could be. Feminism, as I tell my classes, has done a terrible job of branding itself. When I ask students to write essays explaining feminism, I get papers back that inevitably begin, "I am not a feminist, but," and then they go on to make great arguments, great feminist claims about whatever it is they're talking about. This is not to say, however, that feminism is perfect. As a movement, some of the loudest voices speaking for feminism promoted white, heterosexual, cisgender interests. They have not cared to, or at least not done a good job of, representing a wider range of women's voices. I believe firmly that this is changing and actively seek to be part of that change. In doing so, what I appreciate about feminism, in addition to, first of all, starting by taking women's lives seriously, secondly, seeking equality, and third, challenging patriarchy, is that it highlights sources of empowerment and challenge that we don't necessarily see when we take for granted the traditional or historical, those kinds of words I love to hate as an active, curious feminist, these historical stories about the world around us. For example, an anecdote from my own research on Northern Ireland. In the late 60s, in response to paramilitary terrorism, in particular the Irish Republican Army, the British military locked down a neighborhood known as the Falls because of suspected IRA activity. They literally barred people from traveling in and out. They instituted a curfew, making it impossible for families to go to the grocery store, people to go to work, kids to go to school, while they searched and tore up houses looking for weapons. This was known as the Rape of the Lower Falls, because of the ways that this outside power forced its way into people's private spaces in their homes. The lockdown ended, however, and this is the cool feminist part of the story, when women from a nearby neighborhood, armed with milk and bread, forced these military men, and they were all men, forced these military men aside and marched into the community. The military likely would have stood up to men if it had been men marching, demanding entry. They had done it before, and riots were the result. But for women, exercising solidarity, support, and compassion, the barriers were removed, and the needs of the community were met. The people were fed. What I value about feminism is that it helps us focus our attention on stories that don't always get told, stories about solidarity, stories about alternative forms of power. Despite the fact that these stories are so important to our own history, these are the stories that feminism helps us to capture. So, our panelists tonight will address two questions, and they will try to be brief, and then we will open the time to Q&A. So please think about what you'd like to hear them speak on. Without further preamble on my part, let's turn to Drs. Hemming, Wilkemer, and Abe in that order, if that's okay. First, if you would please share with us your biographical discovery. What is your feminist coming to reckoning or coming out story?
So I'm talking about this first question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. It's so invigorating to be a part of a group of thoughtful women talking about these issues. It's lonely sometimes to be a feminist. Yeah, my story. I think I have always been known in my family as a contrarian. My mother called me difficult. And no doubt, I remember I was stubborn and I had opinions. And in retrospect, I see this as a training ground for feminist praxis. You could say that I was born with feminist tendencies, inclinations. Sarah Ahmed in Living a Feminist Life says, she asks, is it possible to have been a feminist right from the beginning? Maybe you tended that way, a feminist way, because you already tended to be a rebellious or even willful girl who would not accept that place she had been given. So being a feminist for me has always been about finding empowerment in contrarianism. If gender is defined as a restriction of possibility for men and women, then feminism is maybe straining against those restrictions and in the process necessarily becoming, to quote Ahmed again, a site of disturbance, a spoil sport who disrupts the smooth flow of normative operations, the old standard girls being girls and boys just being boys that we say to dismiss bad behavior. As a lesbian and a gender non-conforming person, I've always been this, a problem, a pain in the ass, a killjoy who disturbs the happiness of others by daring to call out a sexist joke, a racist microaggression, a homophobic remark, and by daring to be mistaken for a man in public places, right? Which is to say, to shame others for their mistakes by daring to present as I do, right? This is the birth of a feminist praxis, right? Is to not shy away from those things. And this is an important point. An all too common strategy to contain the counter momentum that is feminist willfulness or contrarianism is to label feminists the problem. You're reading too much into things. Stop being so sensitive. Why did you have to ruin everyone's good time by calling out Uncle Bill for his racist joke or for his sexist comment? We've all heard these things before, right? And you're probably recalling experiences when you've heard those things. So to me, that's where my feminism tends to sort of rear its head the most. And those are often uncomfortable moments, but those are also really important moments.
Okay. I assume that means it's me. And my story is less eloquent and more raw than Jeannie's. And I'm going to be very honest. I grew up in a very patriarchal home. I'm going to give you two examples just of how it was so. I've bitten my fingernails my entire life. And when I was 11 and just about to hit puberty, my father pulled me aside and offered me $100 a fingernail if I would stop biting them because, and I quote, "No man will ever want you if you keep doing that." So I nodded and I went into my room and I bit my fingernails until my fingers were bleeding and pretty much have stuck to the habit ever since. I was furious, hurt, I guess, in some ways. And I started to think, am I interested in someone who's just interested in my fingernails? It felt flimsy, wrong, bad. And I found that I had gotten the habit of hiding them at the same time that I kept biting them. So it bothered me. It also bothered me that we weren't allowed to, as per my father's orders, eat a lot because you weren't allowed to be chunky. So we had a stash of junk food in with the laundry detergent in the basement because my father didn't know that you actually did laundry. So it was very safe to go down into the basement and do the laundry, which, by the way, was never a problem at our house for volunteers. Go down, do the laundry, and have snacks that you weren't allowed to have in public. So there was this whole shaming thing. And I think I vowed pretty early on that I wasn't going to essentially be made to feel that way. I didn't understand it exactly. I just felt hurt and angry and shamed by it and rebellious. All of us were about it. And then when I got to college, I started taking classes and reading, and my favorite class that I learned the most about was called Japanese Women, and my dad wouldn't pay for it because he thought it was stupid. And so I had to pay for it if I wanted to take it. And it was in that class when I learned about other women's struggles, so that I could start to see the feelings that I felt growing up in them, because men, specifically sometimes their fathers, were telling them how they were supposed to be and look and feel in the world so that they would be acceptable to other people. And as I started to figure out that I didn't want to be that I wanted to resist against the notion that I had to be acceptable to someone else first. And as soon as you become aware of that and you start to read and start to understand how gender is relational, your position in it, and you start to push back against it, it feels empowering and fantastic. And you realize the only way to win this game is actually to change it. And yet it's terrifying. It's still scary sometimes, because if you resist what you're supposed to be to get the approval and acceptance, you resist. Sometimes you give up opportunities. Sometimes you give up friends. Sometimes you give up a feeling of being accepted, which is what Jeannie was referencing when she says it's lonely. And so you're kind of caught in this sense of being empowered and resisting, and then also being fearful and a little scared to do the resisting, and yet knowing you have to. So it's complicated. It's my story.
Thank you so much. I was trying to send the link to my colleague Dana. Mindy, he said he was trying to get in, but he couldn't. It's not letting him in for some reason. Anyways, I am deeply honored to be, profoundly honored to be in this panel with Michelle, whom I love and adore, and Jeannie, whom I think Jeannie's a badass, and I wish to be like her, to have her fierceness. I prepared remarks because I'm an academic, but I will be speaking from the heart later on. So bear with me. Hopefully I won't sound too scholarly. I came to feminism in Haiti, my birth country. I came to feminism through my mother, an educator and a pastor's wife. I came to feminism through acute observations that rules did not apply to boys and men the way they did to girls and women. I came to feminism as a feminist, and that echoes Jeannie's rebellion and opinionated young self. I came as a feminist who had not acquired the language and methodology of mainstream feminism, who had not mastered the history nor agreed with the manicured distinctions of first wave, second and third wave feminisms, yet who has observed and participated in challenging the status quo with, I guess, my rebellion and my opinions that are unwelcome and whatever. Why, you may ask? Simply put, my experiences as an immigrant and a Black woman have not historically been placed at the center of mainstream feminism. My multiple identities have found resonance in mainstream feminism, Black feminism, border crossing feminism, and transnational feminism. That is why, growing up, I have surrounded myself and have gravitated towards strong women, hoping and wishing that I could one day fill their shoes. And by strong women, I do not mean the racist, stereotypical standards that endow Black women with superpower strength, dehumanizing them in the process, where they do not benefit from any help, protection, empathy, or care. So these strong women, they taught me about feminism. They taught me how to navigate power, how to bend to better rise up, how to concede without defeat, and how to hold on to my dignity. The same mother who taught me feminism also taught me that feminism is deeply flawed. I observed this woman, for whom I have unmeasurable admiration, and others like her, who have fought and labored for the advancement of young girls and women, police them. Bodies of young girls in the Caribbean, notably in the Christian church, are constantly under surveillance. How short is that skirt? How form-fitting is that dress? How long is that handshake with the opposite sex? Men were always fragile human beings to not tempt into sinning. It is the politics of respectability. That's right. Caribbean women are expected to be the guardians of respectability and morality for the entire culture, thereby being complicit, and I will admit my participation in the past in upholding patriarchal values. I love teaching Caribbean literature and journey with my students on the treacherous joys and perils around Caribbean womanhood, ripping vigorous indignation along the way, and most often than not, to arrive at the conclusion that they have more in common with their island sisters than they realize. At Washington University in St. Louis, I made my formal entry in mainstream feminism, earning a certificate in gender and sexuality studies. I learned about the waves, read the works of the Holy Trinity of French feminism, Luce Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, and Hélène Sixou, pored over the rich contributions of feminists of color, and stayed amazed at how much there's left to be done. Feminism for me is ever changing. It is in constant movement and negotiation. It imposes on me a sense of duty. It challenges me to be loving and supporting of other women. It compels me to stretch and accommodate those with different perspectives and viewpoints. Most importantly, feminism strengthens my resolve to ensure that my two boys become ardent and raging feminists.
Awesome. Thank you so much, each of you, for sharing your journey and process and introducing us to what you mean in bits and pieces when we talk about feminism. The second question then, sort of building on that, is where would you like to see feminism going in the future? In particular, in context of correcting the problems of the past. We'll go in the same order. Jeannie, if you want to start us off.
Sure. This is probably going to seem like a contradiction with my earlier remarks, but stick with me for a second. The president of feminism right now, I think the president of feminism, the president of anti-racism is angry, and it should be. It's tired, and it should be. And so when I think about the future of feminism, when I contemplate what's next, I hope, right, that the future of feminism is open, that it leaves room for transformation and connection. And that's why I say that maybe it seems like a contradiction to the idea of embracing the role of killjoy, of contrarianist. We can be both, and we can demand better of the world and also show compassion. And so I'm thinking here of kindness, and maybe not trying to ruin people's lives because they have a mental illness or fail to cope in a single moment, which is something that we see happening with cancel culture. The Karen who we're so eager to shame and scorn is, after all, when looked at from a different angle, an invention of sexism and intolerance, of an ugly impulse to judge others and to shame others to make ourselves feel more powerful. And I'm tired of it. I'm done with that. And I think we need to find a better path. A recent example is the woman in Target, right? She was frustrated and angry and upset and had something like a breakdown of her mental health, and, acted out in a very public way and lost her job and lost her career and lost relationships with people. And I don't, we are all the accumulation of experience and action, but it's important that we also acknowledge that we all have the capacity to change, to become other than what we are in any particular moment. And that just feels really, really relevant to me right now. Sarah Ahmed, who I reference often because she's a hero of mine, reminds us that, quote, "There is no guarantee that in struggling for justice, we ourselves will be just. We have to hesitate to temper the strength of our tendencies with doubt," end quote. So let me be clear. I absolutely believe that some people show us over and over who they are, and evil people must absolutely be called out and canceled. Marilyn Manson. We need to stand and fight and say in a loud voice, "Not here. No, we won't tolerate this." But we must also make room for compassion, healing, and change. And so the future of feminism is one that resists the lure of purity politics, the naive demand for a perfect ethical state from ourselves and from others, which is in the end impossible to achieve. Purity politics is easy because it's unproductive. It's a convenient excuse to disengage from the hard, messy, sweaty work of feminism. But purity politics also does damage. In her book, Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times, Alexis Shotwell argues that, quote, purity is simultaneously inadequate, impossible, and politically dangerous for shared projects of living on the earth, end quote. So instead, if we want a world with less suffering and more flourishing, it would be useful to perceive complexity and complicity as the constitutive situation of our lives, rather than as things we should seek to avoid. And so the future of feminism that I yearn for is one that expects us to stay with the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, to sort of live in the messiness of human relationships, and to be open and compassionate and kind, even as we demand better from those around us and from ourselves. I do want to mention just briefly before I finish my archive. I want to make sure people have an opportunity to read some of these incredible feminist texts that are so important to me. Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life is really important to me. Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble. And then N.K. Jemisin is someone I've been reading lately, and she's just awesome. And her book, How Much Longer Till Black Future Month, is something that everyone should read. It's a collection of science fiction short stories that will just really challenge your views of things. Anyway, I end my remarks there. Thank you.
Okay, I want to make two central points when I talk about what I hope the future of feminism will be. And because I'm a sociologist, they both have to do with gender as a system for organizing not only society, but interaction, and sometimes but our individual psyches too. So the points that I will make are in reference to how we need to change that systemic gendered power relations across all the levels of society, from the individual to interaction to institution. And I want to, the first point that I want to make is that I hope that feminism from this point as we go forward will learn from its past mistakes. If you read some of, for example, a great sociologist who studied the feminist social movement is Verda Taylor, and she talks about very clearly how feminists undercut themselves by making the movement very white, very heterosexual, and by trying to garner support amongst sort of mainstream culture by denigrating other subordinate groups of women effectively. So women of color, anyone who wasn't a straight woman, and then certainly there was a class base to it as well. So the idea was that instead of joining together, have all subordinated groups join together, work together, understand they have common cause and common love, they sort of push them out to try to make more progress, and they undercut themselves. And so one of the things that we see sociologically, without a doubt in social research of all marginalized groups, is when we pit one marginalized group against another, then what we end up doing really is empowering the elites. And there's a big long process that I won't go into behind that, except to say that when people in power work by pitting a subordinate group against another subordinate group, so they think the subordinate group one thinks that their problems come from subordinate group number two. And if they just keep fighting, then the powerful get to do whatever they want. And so I hope that the future of feminism includes bringing all sorts of groups into the discussion about a socially just and fair world where Jeannie won't have to ruin anybody's party. So that's one part of it. The other part that I think gets left off of many discussions is the relational nature of gender. That is to say, we only understand femininity in relation to masculinity and vice versa. They are a system. And we continually talk about empowering women. Believe me, I'm for empowering the hell out of women. And that was the nicest word I could come up with. Okay, so I scaled it down in my head like 3 notches right there. So I am not arguing against that. I am saying that recognizing that empowering women includes having to change or shift masculinity and masculine scripts and what it means to be masculine. And I'm going to give an example using a very fine research study that one of my students is doing at the time. And essentially, I'm going to give you a little nutshell version of what she's doing. She's looking at sexual agency amongst college-age women and men. And one of the things that she finds is that while both men and women agree that women should have sexual agency, what men mean essentially is that they have the right to say no, and they have the right to respond to their overtures as they wish. But these are responses. In other words, what she's finding is that agency is the right to respond as you wish, not demand as you wish. And then men don't feel free to say, no, I don't like that, because they're supposed to like all things sexual, right? And sex has to be about performance for them on some level. And so they can't let go of that in order to find, and I'm not talking about all men, I'm talking about large scale patterns or all women. But essentially, without a shifting for both, women's demands will continue to be, and their desire to be empowered will continue to be thwarted, and men won't live full, rich lives understanding the standpoints of others. So I think that one of the things that we have to do is to open the discussion in feminism, not just to include what women want to do and how they want to be in power, but to expand it a great deal about what men lose by not being feminists, and bring more men into understanding about gender as relational and the advantages to shifting a masculine script and getting rid of a life that has to be, expressed in only like 4 emotions. Okay, all right, I will stop there.
Lovely. Michelle, I can hear you speak from now to eternity. All right. So the question that I am attempting to answer, and I don't have an answer to, is to look at where feminism is going in the future by also looking in the context of correcting the problems of the past. So I will be alluding to the past briefly. On March 3rd, 1913, about 108 years from yesterday, in a fight for the right to vote, 8,000 women marched in Washington, D.C. Among them was a fighter, the anti-lynching crusader and suffragist Ida B. Wells, who was told by her white sisters to march at the back or not at all. She fearlessly and rightfully took her place eventually at the front of the line and marched. Numerous feminists of color have lamented how mainstream white feminism often fails to show up for women of color. Let's look at wages, for instance. Employment equality statistics indicate that all women make 70 cents to a men's dollar. In reality, white women make that much, and women of color make less than white women. As the Black feminists Mickey Kendall observed, the sad reality, and I quote, the sad reality is that while white women are an oppressed group, they still wield more power than any other group of women, including the power to oppress both men and women of color. In the 2016 elections, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, a man who made his views about misogyny, racism, sexism, xenophobia abundantly clear. Where am I going? In feminism, we often talk about sisterhood, solidarity, lesbian continuum, so many cute and fuzzy words that capture and epitomize the ways in which women should have each other's backs. The death of George Floyd ripped the blindfold and forced mainstream America to reckon with the fact that racism is alive and well, that communities of color are disproportionately affected and harmed by white supremacy policies, that social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice have eluded these communities. I have been alternatively angry, annoyed, scared, and ultimately exhausted with being Black and a woman. And some of you guys, if you guys want to think about Kimberly Crenshaw intersectionality, that might echo that as well. Until those with privilege step up for real and make room for marginalized bodies to occupy the center, feminism would be severely limited. Allies and accomplices need to inform themselves, read, ask, instead of assuming what kind of help is needed. Make and cultivate genuine friendships with people of color. Wield your privilege when necessary to challenge and uproot racist and misogynistic policies. The future of feminism is as simple as this. It demands that none of us become oppression tourists. Ultimately, the future of feminism is forward-thinking and transformational. Thank you.
All right, y'all, that's the portion of our program that's prepared and organized. At this point, if you'd like, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post questions. I will moderate that list as we go and offer these questions to our panelists, although we don't have any as of yet. So I feel like there's a Jeopardy song bonging around in the background here. Although actually I do have a quick question for Jeannie. You mentioned 3 books when you were talking, and Jema was able to capture 2 of them, the one from Ahmed and from Jemison. What was the third you mentioned?
Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
I want to make maybe a point of connection that I wouldn't have made if I weren't a witness to a really wonderful teaching demonstration today about disability studies, but it connects to Andia's point about what women of color need from white women, white feminists, and you said to ask, right? The reference today, and I'm not going to be able to come up with the author's name, but the book was called Staring, and it had to do with how we, the sort of visual disturbance that is the experience of encountering somebody with a disability and not knowing what to do, right? And so we can look, which is can be perceived as rude, or we can look away, which is also can be perceived as a kind of erasure, right? And we have not been good. Rosemary Garland Thompson is the author. Thank you, Emily. We have not been good at developing strategies to engage with those we want to be in solidarity with, but whose standpoints are different, right? To refer back to something Michelle said. And I think that that's really important. We need to stop shying away. We need to stop looking away. We need to stop shying away from conversations that can be uncomfortable, right? But that will help us sort of connect with each other in really important ways. Is that making sense?
So in the, what was that?
I mean, is there a question? Because if
Yes.
not,
Yes.
okay.
No. While we were talking, and actually, Marissa put this, and Marissa, I think you go by Mars. Is that right? Deeply hopeful I just said that right. Anyway, asks a question. She put it originally in chat and then moved it to the Q&A, which I appreciate. Why is the Karen quick to be dismissed and sneered at, but the Chads of the world are funny and tolerable? Absolutely no reflection to our very own, very lovable, very actively feminist and engaging Chad Fullwider. But why do we dismiss and sneer at the Karens, but we love and tolerate the Chads?
Because sexism. There's a really great, I'm sort of doing research as we're talking about, there's a really great article in The Atlantic called The Mythology of Karen. The meme is so powerful because of the awkward status of white women. And I think that's worth sort of going and reading. But no, I do think it has something to do with our sort of a cultivation lately in our culture to clutch our pearls and stand in judgment of others, and whatever organ in our bodies that that empathy comes from seems to be atrophying. Maybe there's something in the water, I don't know. But I think that there's a lack of empathy, and I think it's exacerbated by social media and sort of the virality of these videos and these memes. It's really easy to sit in our armchairs and stand in judgment of others because we don't know them, right? And so alienation, compounds alienation in these moments. So that's sort of an answer. It's not in any way the answer to that question.
No, I think part of it, to pick up on what you're saying, part of, and this again is not the answer, it would be a very complicated answer, but I mean, part of it is that the person who gets to stand in as standard, normative, appropriate, the way it should be, versus, and so any person who, that would be the chat, the person who challenges that is the person who opens themselves to derision at any given time, right? Because you're challenging the acceptable, the normative. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that one of the great problems with privilege is it's difficult to question because the privileged don't see it and other people do and take it for granted. And then anyone who approaches that is easier to pick on because they're less powerful and it makes sense in their minds to do it that way. In addition to, I think we've gotten pretty callous about stuff, almost had to be honest, in some ways.
Can I also piggyback on that and extend that same sort of like metaphor to the notion of the angry Black women and how Black women in particular, well, women, you are not supposed to be enraged. You are not supposed to be angry. In particular, Black women, and yet we see how at rallies white men are frothing at the mouth in rage, and we see that pundits, men, white men in particular, are able to use rage as a weapon, but then at the same time Black women are demonized for that same rage. So I see a correlation, Marissa, with the question that you raised about the Karens and the Chads. Again, at that root, you have gender, and with me bringing the angry Black woman, you have race.
Another example of the ways in which intersectionality, like, we can't separate this conversation out. Let me say that differently. We could definitely separate this conversation out from intersectionality, and then we lose sight of all the voices that many of us are hoping to be working with and fighting alongside and supporting and engaging. And so for me, feminism is deeply tied into conversations about intersectionality, that it isn't just a particular vision or view of what woman is, but that it's more about drawing attention to a particular kind of privilege, to critiquing a particular kind of privilege, so that it isn't just that we're working for women, that we're working for anyone being minimized, dismissed, ignored, forgotten alongside a hegemonic masculinity, right? Because it's also, this is a little bit fraught and a longer conversation, but it's also not, it isn't all men, right? Okay, so we have sparked a handful of questions in the Q&A, and I also got one in text that I'm gonna ask first. Moderator privilege, that's me acting on my privilege, I suppose.
Can I interrupt for a
Sure.
second? Okay, before you get on the next topic, I wanna point out that some of what Andia was just discussing is what I was talking about in the future, when we were talking about the future of feminism, in terms of subordinate groups being splintered apart and sort of at loggerheads with one another, because it is difficult sometimes, even for women who consider themselves ardent feminists, to understand. They resent the notion that their struggle is not the hardest one. In other words, that other people with race, class, sexuality, kinds of identities that get sort of layered into that their struggle can be harder than the white, privileged, educated, middle-class woman's struggle. And some women will push back against that as though her experience has been undercut. So part of what I think, and I'm not talking about academics per se, but I'm saying in sort of wider culture, we have to be able to hear struggle without one invalidating the other better than we are, I think.
I think one of the strategies that we see, that I have seen, is this sort of move to relatability. Oh, I can totally, you're reading a book about the experience of a person of color, a woman of color, fiction or nonfiction, and the sort of sensitive white person room. Oh, I can completely relate to that struggle. It's like, well, but you can't. And I know that it feels safe to want to relate, because relatability is a way to, it feels like you're listening and it feels like empathy, but it's also a little bit of appropriation. I was in a reading group recently. We were reading a book called Bandwidth Recovery, which is about how minority students have a harder time in school, and success in college is more difficult for them because of all the things that sort of steal their bandwidth, right? And a very educated white man in the room said, oh, I completely relate to that. I have just really suffered from bandwidth depletion. It's like, oh, sure, everyone does, but not in those same ways. And in your effort to relate, you're undermining the argument that some people's situation is different in important ways that we need to talk about and deal with. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the conversation. We can move on to the question.
Okay, so a student asks about reconciling feminism, and in particular, this idea that white women want to free Islamic women from the hijab. So how does feminism maybe sort of reconcile itself with these sort of push-pull impulses maybe, or visions of what that looks like. I'm going to start, if that's okay. Have not ever experienced wearing a hijab. I will say that the idea of it challenges me. That's speaking from my own experience, from my own version of what I want my public life to look like. Academically, however, I have studied a number of, and so now this is me one step removed from that, or several steps removed from that experience, but academically have studied Islamic feminists and read a great deal about the ways in which the hijab is interpreted in their lives, in their writing, in their feminism, to be liberating. And I think that could be for a number of reasons, religious or social, or to walk publicly and be confident and feel secure and be happy in the way that you are approaching the world, right? However you see, wherever you see that. Ultimately, for me, feminism is driven by critical theory. Critical theory itself is a body of theory that looks at the world and says, here's what we're taking for granted, here's why that's problematic, who's suffering, right? And starts asking the questions, why are we taking this for granted? Who suffers, who benefits because of the ways in which we approach this situation? In all of that, and I'm super shorthanding, so I'm sorry about that, critical theory is also emancipatory. The goals of critical theory are to liberate those who, or to encourage, to support people liberating themselves. In my mind, then, feminism is absolutely liberationist. It's emancipatory. Its goals are to seek equality, to liberate people from the subordination, the oppression that they're experiencing in their lives. For me, then, coming to the student's particular question or that particular example of it, I don't actually think there's anything to reconcile here. As an individual who's never been asked to wear a hijab and never had that experience, of course that seems foreign to me. As an individual who chooses it, who feels safe, who feels secure, who feels happy, appropriate, beautiful, engaging, right? Whatever any of those things are that we want to be when we face the world, if that's emancipation for you, then I support the feminism of your emancipation.
I'm going to do something strange with this, and I'm not entirely sure it's going to work. So I reserve the right to say in sociology, in sex and gender, we do a spiel on cosmetic surgery. And if you read the study that we look at, many of the women who engage in cosmetic procedures, and I'm talking about invasive cosmetic procedures, not, where it's surgery, actual surgery, they find it emancipatory. They feel like they are reclaiming the power of themselves. It is their individual choice, they believe, and it feels good. And one of the things that they're feeling essentially is what Sandra Barkey calls repressive satisfactions, the joy of getting closer to an idealized image that they hold for them. And so moving forward feels empowered, moving towards that idealized image feels empowering to them. Is it? I don't know. And I can't speak for them. And so my tendency isn't to try to speak for individual women and their choices, but to try to look at the systems in which they make those choices, to see if their choices are coerced and in some way reproductive of the problem and to comment on that larger tendency rather than an individual kind of decision-making framework. So in much the same way, Mandy, I'm agreeing with you. If it's a choice, we honor it. It doesn't stop us from looking at a system and saying that the choices this person had to make were this, and examining not the individual's choices, but the consequences of systemic structures rather than one person. I don't know if I'm going to agree with myself or not here, but I think so far.
I think that works because it suggests that we can look at issues, right, from multiple vantage points.
Yeah.
Right.
Including their right to choose something that feels.
That's right. That's right. Andia, did you want to? You're muted.
That's why I hate Zoom. Anyways, Michelle, imagine 2023. That's one of those things that we're not going to miss. You are muted, or turn your camera on. Anyways, I think Michelle, Mandy, and I agree with you. Ultimately, it comes down to this: this person has the choice to see this fabric, which we Westerners see as, and Westerners, I mean, in general, as oppressive, and somehow use our cultural interpretation, impose our cultural interpretation in wanting to save, in wanting to free these women of color, for the most part, who are wearing the hijab. And this is where, in my introduction, when I was talking about all the way I am informed by virtue of my multiple identities, how I am informed by all these feminisms that I have mentioned. And that's where I would separate myself, right, from mainstream feminism, because I have seen it. I have seen, because, my parents are missionaries, I have seen the white savior sort of like enterprise coming to Haiti to save Black babies, and yet in their backyards, they're dealing with all this racist crap, right? So feminism has this noble goal to liberate and free, especially bodies of color who are exotic and culturally different from ours, and we deem that they need to be rescued and saved, and we go about it the wrong way. I think we need to just back the hell off and just, let, again, a lot of women who wear the hijab have said it is liberating for them and they don't need to be saved. And point back, that's it. We just need to respect that.
There's a difference between looking at a system that is not egalitarian versus pointing at a person and saying you're being a conformist. There's very different things. I think that's, if I had to sum up the distinction, I'm going to go with that one.
Did I just adequately share that and then unshare it?
You did.
Can you see the cartoon, or do you see my screen?
No, we see the cartoon.
You do see the cartoon. Okay, good. Well, it's interesting to me that where I started on one of this, and then Michelle's answer was like the other version of this, sort of represented by this cartoon, but that we're each talking about the ways in which we respond to whatever the expectations are in our given social and political worlds, right?
Well, so I am actually I've not worn a hijab, but I have been spent time in a Muslim culture and have worn a head wrap out of respect and deference for the women who invited me to participate in one of their ceremonies celebrating the birth of a child. And I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't feel uncomfortable because it was a different religious practice or anything having to do with sort of Western ideas about feminism, I felt uncomfortable because it felt very, I would have felt just as uncomfortable wearing a skirt. And so I want to use the notion of containment to think about this, right? Me wearing a skirt, or certain expectations about the way I should dress because I'm a woman, feel like containment. They feel like my life is and my presentation is being directed in ways that are not comfortable to me. And it's in those moments that I feel my outsiderness, my otherness most. But some people put on skirts and don't feel that. They don't feel contained by that presentation. So I think the idea that a woman is, being a sort of othered or subjected by virtue of wearing a hijab that she put on herself probably depends on whether or not that presentation feels like an act of being directed, an act of being contained or not. And I think we always need to attend to the specificity of the individual making that choice, or in some cases, not being allowed to make that choice.
Panelists, we have 8 really awesome questions, and I would very much like to engage in all of them. We don't have time. So I am, those of you who asked really awesome questions a little bit early, please forgive me. I'm going to skip right to the end and ask that the panelists give their sort of concluding thoughts with this one. Don't worry, you'll like it. Are you ready? Do we have to be feminist all the time? Maybe it is just because I am not a good feminist, but sometimes it feels exhausting.
You need to read Roxane Gay, Bad Feminism, or Bad Feminist, can't remember which. She talks about this a lot, and you will appreciate that. One of the things you have to remember as feminists, we have to have a sense of humor. We have to be able to laugh, and we have to be able to, watch stupid TV shows from the 80s that in retrospect were probably making sort of racist off-color jokes. And we celebrate the fact that now we know better. That's my perspective. You could really cult a life of unhappiness if you can't give yourself permission to laugh and dance and be joyful and celebrate our complicated, messy existence.
So we watch movies every Friday night. It's what we do as a family, and sometime my kids are going to be teenagers and I'm going to lose all of that, and it will be terrible and tragic. But for now, we watch a movie every Friday night together, the 4 of us, and we rotate pick, right? So Connor picks one, and Nicole, and then mom, and then dad, and inevitably there's some kind of lesson happening or something that I need to correct, something that's happening on the screen when Derek or I pick classic movies. By classic, I mean older than the 2000s, right? And I have to pause it and explain, like, why is this not okay? Or do you think this was okay? And why isn't it? And what could we be doing better? And at some point the other day, and I say that is probably last year, my daughter, Nicole, who's almost 12 now, says, Mom, we are not your students. Could we just watch the movie tonight? And I thought, you know what? Yes, we can just watch the movie. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. We'll come back to all of those things. There will be a lecture. I hope you take notes. There will be a quiz. But to just give yourself that moment to just be in your own life for a minute, right?
I'll take a stab at answering this question. And part of it was, do you always have to be a feminist? And my answer is twofold. Hell yes, and you're not going to be able to stop. Once you've developed a feminist sensibility, it just comes at you. Is it tiring? Yeah. Okay. That said, it doesn't have to be at front and center of your every interaction that you have. Do it when it matters. If there's an 86-year-old man who says something sexist, let it go. Just let it go. If it's, 86-year-old, who wasn't Jeannie, Uncle Bill?
Even when it's your dad. Lately, it's been my dad.
Well, just in your head, say something smart ass and let it go, because you're not going to change their mind, and they're not shaping the world.
That's absolutely right.
Pick the moments where you have impact. And think about how to persuade your audience, not punish them, not rebuke them, not tell them they're, sexist assholes. You can say that in your head. I don't get through a day where that doesn't happen, but challenge them a little bit in fun, in solidarity, not in always hostility. And by the way, when it's time to bring hostility, I say bring it as hard as you can. You'll know when that is, when they've crossed the line, a big one and a hurtful one, then you step right the hell up, because here's true story. I left this out of the biographical part. I crossed it out after Jeannie was talking. But when I was very little, my grandpa died young. He was Jewish, lost his whole family, Holocaust thing. And he died when I was little. When I was 5, he told me, I'm going to tell you something you're not going to understand. I said, all right. He said, don't you ever walk by someone treating another person like they're not a human without getting in the way. Okay. I didn't know what it meant. I remember. That's when you talk. You talk then, you talk when you can change minds, and then, give Uncle Bill the finger. And that's what I have to say. Okay.
Michelle, that was so eloquently put, and that's why I am so in love with you. Okay. For me, being a feminist, being a woman, being a feminist, being Black is a 24-hour phenomenon. We as girls and women, we have been reared to see other women as competition. We have been reared to be petty, jealous, mean. And I'm not about that. This is where being a feminist worked for me. I am intentional to love on women, to appreciate women, to uplift women, even when I don't like those women. I have been intentional, and it hurts. It means that I have to swallow my pride, because I want to put kindness into the world. I want to put love into the world. I want to, because I saw Bree's question, womanist, feminist. Alice Walker said, womanist is to feminist what lavender is to purple. Ultimately, it's, again, those fuzzy words that I used earlier: solidarity, allies, accomplices, lesbian continuum. We need to come together, and together we can make some good. And so whether it's what Michelle's grandfather, who has lived horror, who knows what injustice is, what complicity, the harm, and the deadly consequences of being complicit, of being silent. It's as simple as that. Especially white people, I have to call on white people, because you have power and you have privilege, and it's not about superiority or inferiority. I don't see myself inferior to Jeannie or Michelle or Mandy. Hell no. But the world, whether I admit it or not, automatically opens more doors for Mandy and Jeannie and Michelle. It's just as simple as that. And maybe if I am going to be even more honest, maybe Mandy, as an assistant professor who come after me, gets paid more money than I. It's as simple as that. That's how the world is. I cannot do anything about it to change that. But what I can do is, again, put love into the world, put kindness into the world, and embracing each other. I love this panel. I love the fact that we come from different fields and different perspectives, and yet we are, whether we each come to feminism and approach feminism and act on feminism from different angles and different experiences, backgrounds, but ultimately the goal is the same. and it can be exhausting, but like Michelle said, once you have developed that sensibility, it's natural, baby, and you just have to roll with it.
I want to add to what Andy is saying that, and this is for students, what you're learning here will give you choices. It will allow you to see things. You will be able to pick your paths. It will give you, your secondary education will give you the ability to shape things in ways that other people do not. And it is a tremendously empowering, liberating thing. It also creates an obligation and a recognition that is painful. You don't get to just have the empowerment. You have to have the responsibility. And with the responsibility, and what you see, comes the burden. And I don't know any way around it.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone figures that out, though, definitely drinks on me.
Well, we are at 7:00 for a supposed 1-hour panel, 7:06, excuse me, for a supposed 1-hour panel. Fellow feminists, do you have concluding thoughts, or did we just hear them? Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we sign off?
Somebody wants to know whether this discussion will be posted anywhere.
I was just typing an answer to that. The recording will be posted as part of our Women's History Month. That is going to be a thing I think is maybe in progress with Jama Grove. So she will definitely have the answer, but wherever that is, that's where that's gonna go. So Jama Grove is yes, and we'll let you know as soon as we can. Yes, the site was just created today, she says. So awesome. It will go there. As will, I think, the recordings from any of the panels or the spirit series that we're doing for this month should find their way onto that website.
I want to add a thank you to Jama for just pulling everything together so beautifully. She's worked very, very hard.
Y'all, speaking of fierce feminists, how awesome is it that Dr. Jama Grove has joined our faculty and our department? I'm so thrilled to have her here and be working with her.
Jima is awesome. We have not mentioned at all trans women, and there was a question sent to my phone about that, and I believe there was a comment also. Trans women are our sisters, and they need to be brought into the fold, and especially Black trans women. They no matter what's going on about trans women, if there is a racial component, they are going to suffer that racial component. So trans women, the statistics are horrible, abysmal for trans women, and we will hopefully have another panel where we can adequately address their role, their place among us feminists.
I will add to that. One of the things that I've read some of the poorly branded feminism that is anti-trans women, and I think there's confusion about acknowledging that the experience of a cisgender woman as being different from a trans woman, like, we can acknowledge that a trans woman does not have the same kinds of experience that a biologically female body has. Of course they don't. But if feminism seeks equality, then we need to seek equality, and that's everybody, right? Regarding of whether or not we have the same kinds of embodied experiences as women. To be a trans woman is also to need the fight against patriarchy, the solidarity of women, to need the fight for equality. And I am sorry that we didn't have more time to bring that up. And so Andi, I appreciate you bringing that in because that has not been part of the conversation yet. But equality means everybody, everybody. Yeah. All right. I did not want to be the last one talking. Any final thoughts?
We've got some good momentum going. We'll have even more momentum at the end of this month. Let's try to keep it going. I think that we all benefit from this, so I'm game.
Yeah.
There are more events. I don't know if the participants or the attendees are aware, but there are more events that Dr. Grove in the diversity and so many a group of folks are putting together. And in 2 weeks, I am so looking forward to this. I am going to participate. I believe it is March 12th. Jema, is it March 12th? About diasporic studies, talking about transnational feminism, being Black women in academia, being Black women, but also coming from elsewhere Black, which is fascinating. Right, Jema? Is Jema here? Jema, I'm talking about you. March 16th, yes. So that's going to be fun. I'm pretty excited about that.
And Michelle has a talk with ACS on the 9th, Michelle, at 6. Does that sound, or did I mess the time up?
It is March 9th at 4.
At 4, okay, awesome. All of that will be on the website. Oh, awesome, Jema just put in all of these into our chat. Thank you so much, Jema. Jeannie, Michelle, Andia, always a pleasure to see you, my friends. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for being here, for your time, for your awesome questions, for your enthusiasm and support. We look forward to seeing you at all of the other awesome things that Dr. Grove has shown such exceptional leadership in putting together for us. Until then, enjoy the rest of your night. Go be and do good things.
And thank you, Mindy, for being an awesome moderator.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.